It's a lot easier to tell somebody what to do this, do that, technical, tactical, finish the practice, hands in, go home, and switch off until the next practice. It's probably less demanding on your spirit to do that. But if you're going to do this right, you have to invest time. You have to invest in a relationship. You have to invest in that person's journey, not the player's journey only, the person's journey also.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will help you get better at teaching and leading so that you can develop high-performing teams and high-character people.
Coaches, I'm really excited to welcome Alan Keane to the podcast. Alan is a highly regarded performance basketball coach with a focus on meeting the needs of the people he coaches. He's a Great Britain national team head coach, qualified teacher and PhD candidate, and the co-founder of MVMT Sports. In part one of this conversation, we talk about MVMT Sports' 3 core values and what they look like practically. Putting people first, winning and impact don't have to compete, Tech-tac isn't enough, and a lot more. If you enjoy the episode and want to grab a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details to download a free copy of the notes from this conversation or any episode. And if you're interested in learning more about what we offer coaches and organizations, go to cuttingedgecoach.com or just send me an email at luke@cuttingedgecoach.com. Now to part one of my conversation with Alan Keane. Enjoy the episode. Coach is really excited to welcome Coach Alan Keane to the podcast today. Coach, let's start off and talk about MVMT Sports. You co-founded it with Simon Turner, and as I was looking into it and what you guys stand for, there's really 3 things that you guys hit on, and those 3 are coaches who want to put people first, winning and impact don't have to compete, and Tech-tac isn't enough. I want to talk about all 3 of those, but let's just talk about the first one first, putting people first. Will you talk about what that means, maybe why it's so important, and how we can do a better job of it in our coaching?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on, Coach. This is really a privilege. I've enjoyed your podcast, many episodes, so it's quite a privilege to be on. Secondly, let me give more credit to Simon Turner. We co-owned the company MVMT. And Simon very much was the original founder. He picked me up at a time when he got the wheels in motion. So I want to give more credit to Simon for how it all started. But in a nutshell, you've mentioned the 3 core values of MVMT, what its foundational what its foundational habits are, and what we want to build, what we're trying to do with coaches. And it is very much putting people first. And one of our taglines is, sport is a movement for good, not bad. And I think too often, we speak about sport being really good for young people. It builds wonderful characteristics. It builds wonderful traits. And yes, it does, but it only does that in the right environment. I mean, there's plenty of environments we've seen in the sports world, be it professional or be it participation, be it performance, be it leisure, where actually that environment probably leaves a kid walking away feeling less confident, maybe a bit upset, not as happy as they were with the excitement of thinking they're going into a club. So we just got to be very careful of how we package sports, and that's some of the stuff we want to raise. We want to cast a light on, is that it's not always for good, that we need to dig a bit deeper and unpick what's going on in that environment before we start labeling sport as really good for young people's development. So it's really just to raise awareness on that one. And in terms of coaching people, putting people first, we believe at MVMT, and I think it's common sense really, that a player with good mental well-being is much more likely to play with more confidence, to feel more, to commit more to what decisions they make on the field of play, and ultimately become better decision makers, because they're doing it with a freedom to fail without a fear of failure. And I think when you build an environment that puts people first, You really nurture those elements that facilitate growth and development, as opposed to putting winning first or scoreboard first or performance first, where sports has a high percentage of mistakes. So putting people first, we feel, actually improves performance. It makes people play better and develop at a better rate, a faster rate.
Yeah. I love that. Love how you articulated it. And I think that obviously kind of segues into that next one. Winning and impact don't have to compete. And I think you started to hit on it there. But talk more about that, and maybe even talk about, what does that look like for us to embrace as coaches?
Well, I think that's always the challenge, isn't it? I've been coaching in the performance environment for 15 years. I was lucky enough to play in a performance environment, and I felt from my experiences and what I'm learning from other coaches' experiences, just from conversation and dialogue with other coaches, is that it's all about the performance. That we can't have bad practices. Like, how many times have we heard that phrase? Like, this team can't have bad practices. We can only have good practices. Well, actually, that's probably unrealistic, and we're setting ourselves up for failure. We're setting the players up for a fall by just putting that on them and putting that out there openly. And what we're saying is, be mindful of what the players will bring to your practice from their wider world, from their families. If you're working in a team here that's a part-time professional, he'll have a job somewhere else, or there may be kids or a family or different, or they're studying, they're doing exams, or they're in college. Well, they've got different things going on in their life, and there's different tabs open in their head. It's not just the performance tab. So regardless of what we would like to think as performance coaches, like, there is other factors in their life that affects a player. So their concentration may not be as sharp when they come to training. And until we deal with that, we probably can't maximize the performance of that athlete. In the short term, maybe we can force them to block it out for half a practice, one practice. But maybe there's an ongoing issue in that person's wider world that they're going to bring back to the next practice session. So what we're saying about is, results and social impact, or the mental well-being of a person, can coexist. We're not saying they can, we're saying they should, because an athlete is more than an athlete. An athlete is a person, and a person has different things going on in their life other than their sport and other than their performance. So we're back to, actually, let's be mindful, let's be aware, and let's try to support the growth of the person or the challenges the person has, or just be aware of the challenges the person has, and we will get more out of the athlete. And that way we impact results better. So actually, they don't have to be exclusive from each other. They should actually work alongside each other.
Yeah, I love that. And a guest I had on the podcast, Dr. Julie McCleary, essentially, she calls that concept mutually reinforcing. Right. That as you build one, it reinforces the other, and vice versa. And so I love that there. I'm curious, as you said, you've been in the performance environment for a while, professionally and with the national team. And so I'd love to just know a little bit more about what you were talking about, as far as, how do you, in your coaching, identify and engage with some of those athletes, like you were just talking about, that you can tell are bringing something into the environment that's affecting their performance? Like, are there things that you have set up, like routines or systems? Are there ways that you identify and engage with those athletes? Like, what does that look like practically when it plays out for you?
Different ways, different things to do. And I'll give you some practical examples, Luke. Number one is, like you mentioned, the national team. So I'll give it to you from a national team perspective, where we see these players termly. So you'll get your national team, you get to work with your national team hands-on, face-to-face, for probably 4 to 6 weeks in the summer. You might have a camp at Christmas time. As you get older with the under-20s, we don't, because half of them are in college in the States, half are playing pro in Europe. So we really only get them for 4 weeks in the summer. National team under 16s, under 18s, which I did for a period of time, about 10-year period. we would see them for 4 days of Christmas, 4 days and 5 days in Easter time, and then in the summer. So there's a lot of time where you're not seeing the players and staff. Like, let's not forget about the assistant coaches, S&C team manager, and physio, and the performance director in this. So if you put them all together as a team, I see it as the head coach's responsibility to build a relationship from the month of September right through to June, and not wait until you go to that camp, national team camp at Christmas, not wait until you see them in the summer. So if I give you a little story that might bring this to life, it could be better. So with the under 18s a few years ago, GB under 18s, I was advised not to take one player because, he was difficult the previous year. He wasn't what they would class as a team player. He was disruptive on the court, off the court. And I appreciated that feedback. It was important I got that feedback from his previous coaches. However, I made the decision to judge that young man on my watch and try not to be filtered. So have a clean slate about how I think about him, even though that information was helpful. So, that young man, along with the rest of them, I would call them once every 2 weeks from about September. Basically, if I'm in the car driving somewhere, I'd make a list of who I'm calling and how often I'm calling. So I would kind of track my interactions with these players and coaches and just build a relationship. And September, October, November, Luke, the conversation was very much one way with some of the guys because, they weren't as comfortable as we are talking to each other, perfectly fine and understandable. And you're just patient with that. By the time we get to the summer, to fast forward, that young man I just described to you went from being very standoffish for the first few months to, he'd answer questions, but that would be it. It was superficial. It was fine. I had to be patient with building a level of trust, him trusting me. And to make a long story short, we got to the European Championships and I selected that player and we lost the game. And I was being a performance coach and acting the way I do sometimes because I'm human. After a loss to Sweden, I was very quiet and kind of distant on the bus from the players. And this young man got up from his seat, came up from the back of the bus, sat down next to me and asked me, was I okay? And, it really caught me off guard. Like, wow, this is the first time he's really engaged, like, voluntary, not me forcing him to engage or influencing to engage. And he turned around and said, yeah, I'm fine. And he said, Coach, don't worry. We're going to be absolutely fine. Don't worry. It's the second group game. We've got this. Now, we went all the way to the final with that team. And that young man ended up he had like 20 and 19 in the final of a European Championship against Croatia and was guarding a current NBA player, actually. And that was somebody I was told not to select because he was disengaged. He had a bad attitude. He was a bad teammate. But it took an investment of 9 months of phone calls and very much one-way phone calls and just being patient with that in order to get to know that person and in order that person to get to know me and build a level of trust before I could coach him to play at his best. And it took 9 months investment. So that's one way. You pick up the phone, be present with the players. With the club players I see on a daily basis, or I'm part-time coaching in another club in Edinburgh called Burn Your Blaze that I'm doing a lot of coach development work there, and they're an amazing club basically that they really, really have things in place where they're looking after the mental well-being of players. They've got systems in place, strategies. But at that club, we use a practice plan that we've created with movement. And on the first page of that practice plan, and we can get into practice planning later if you want to, but on the first page of that practice plan, there's a section for connections. And you basically write into that section. Now there's a space for 3 players, but obviously it could be more. And you write down the player's name and what message you want to connect with that player that evening. And every time I fill that out, Luke, I'd say 8 times out of 10, it's non-basketball related. And it's forcing me to change my lens and be mindful on where they're at from a loading perspective in their life. We got guys studying at university, got guys with families, guys with part-time jobs. So, it's me being mindful where they're at when they walk in the gym. And, I might judge it on how their body language was in the previous practice, what I write on that connection. So, for example, Luke looked very lacking energy Tuesday night. So my plan with Luke would be Thursday night, just check in with Luke just to see what is like every day. How's life going? How are things? Just have a general conversation 2 minutes before practice, 2 minutes when they walk in the door, fist bump. Hey, Luke, how's everything going? Make it very informal and just see what comes out, just to check in and see, can I pick up on anything that might be going on in your life that I need to be mindful of during that practice session? And the reason being, Luke, I don't want to be the reason that person's cup spills over, because their cup could be quite full. So that there's two practical ways. You have to get on the phone, you have to connect, you have to be patient, but also plan for it. Be intentional with your connections. Be intentional with building that relationship. Be intentional with being aware of what may be going on in their life outside of the sport that you're coaching them in. Yeah,
I love those two things. And I just want to highlight a couple things. First, thanks for sharing the story. Awesome. The things that stood out to me in that story is, like you said, it takes some intentionality. Pick up the phone, but I love that you didn't wait. Like, you didn't wait to build a relationship. You knew who it was going to be, and you started building it long before you actually needed to make those like relational withdrawals at times that come from, the coaching and the hard feedback that you have to give those athletes. Like, you were building up that relationship. You're building up trust is what you highlighted. And I think it's just so important for us to think about that, because, and like you highlighted, like, that trust takes time. It's built in small moments consistently. Like, that's how trust is built. And I mean, I think that's such a powerful story. Like, I see why it caught you off guard that athlete would come up and ask you, right? That he actually reciprocated. I think that's when like, okay, this kid really trusts me here. And he cares about me too. He's seen how much I care about him. He knows this. And now he's reciprocating that. I think that's special. Like, I had chills listening to that story. And I think that's, again, so practical for coaches. Don't wait, and do some small things to build those relationships. And then when you're talking about the practice plan, I just think that is just so simple, but so important. And, I think maybe the most powerful part of it is, like you said, that it's intentional. We write it down, because I think we've all probably walked into a gym or onto a field to get ready to run a practice, and our mind is just consumed with it, right? Okay, I've got to get this set up. I'm thinking through how I'm going to teach this and explain this and we just totally forget about the people that are in front of us. But to actually write it down, to slow down and say, okay, the first things first, I'm going to make sure that I send these messages to these kids, because I think they need it today. That's so important. And go ahead.
And I was just going to add to that, the importance of, I don't think we should ever underestimate the importance of writing down who you're going to connect with and what you're going to connect about. So I'll give you an example from last night. I have my session plan in front of me from last night, and there was 2 players on there I planned to connect with pre-practice. And because pre-practice, I was being pulled in different directions, I forgot to connect with those 2 players. So when we finished practice, it allowed me just to pull my plan out of my pocket, have a look and go, oh, forgot to connect with Luke about that. Where's Luke? Now I'm finding him after practice. If I didn't have that written down, it probably would have escaped me. And as it turned out, I had a wonderful, I'm using using your name, Luke, just to protect the individual. But I had a wonderful conversation with him last night. And he told me stuff that he's having some real difficulties with university. So if I'd have known that before practice, maybe I would have coached him slightly different. As it turned out, I just gave him a lot of credit for actually dealing with that, turning up to practice and actually giving the energy that he gave and showing up to give to others as well. Like, his voice and being a teammate. It was really incredible. Knowing what I know after the practice, what he did during the practice was just amazing. Can I add to this? Can I add to this point? Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Question I would like to ask, not for you, but like for coaches in general, like, if we're not being intentional about raising our awareness of the lives of the players we coach and knowing more and investing time to build a relationship, which could take 9 months, like that young man I gave you an example of. If we're not doing that, then the question remains, why aren't we doing it? And I want to be very transparent about my thoughts on that. And, we hear the term emotional labor being used. And it's exactly that. Like, it takes an investment of your energy, your time, obviously, to actually plan to pick up a phone call to call the national team players on a rotational basis. So they all feel like, and I didn't get this right, by the way, that team I had in 2019, like, I looked back on all the people, I basically make a check sheet. Every time I call someone, I would just tick it off. So, and there were certain players, my gosh, they must have felt left out of that team, actually, because in comparison to 5 or 6 others who I called a lot more. And that was just poor coaching on my behalf. And, like I said, we're all making mistakes in this. And I look back and say, right, well, I've called that player 12 times over the past 9 months. I've only called this player twice, so, but what prevents us being intentional about it? It does take time. It does take effort. It does take energy, and it takes capacity. So, like, Cody Royal wrote a great book about the tough stuff and talked about the weight of coaching. Well, relationships carry weight, and they need capacity in your mind and in your heart. And I think it's really difficult to do. And I think the other part of this is, it's a lot easier to tell somebody what to do this, do that, technical, tactical, finish the practice, hands in, go home, and switch off until the next practice. It's probably less demanding on your spirit to do that. But if you're going to do this right, you have to invest time. You have to invest in a relationship. You have to invest in that person's journey, not the player's journey only, the person's journey also.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important and powerful that you shared that. I love that question. And as I was thinking about it, I think what underlies that question is, again, it's just like, why are you doing this, right? Why are you coaching? Why are you around these young people or these professionals? And hopefully it's to make a positive impact on their life. And if that's it, then we can't just only engage with those tech-tac things. But before we talk about that a little bit, I just remembered something that I wanted to mention earlier that I forgot. With the story you shared, one of the most powerful parts of that story was you had coaches advise you not to take him. And I love what you shared about you decided to give him a clean slate. I think that is something that we could all take, because coaches talk, right? We're connected with coaches that athletes have played for. And it's just really easy for me, for anyone, to take what another adult, another coach has said about an athlete, and then just form a bunch of assumptions about that athlete without actually getting to know them as a person first. Right. And if you would have done that, one, you either probably wouldn't have kept him, or you might have kept him, but then been less likely to invest in that relationship because you thought, well, this guy's just going to be an issue. And then it almost becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where, you've been told these things about this athlete. And so you see it all the time, right? Oh, this guy doesn't work hard. He's a cancer, like whatever it is. And so I think that's really important. I respect that a lot. And I think that's something that as coaches, we need to keep in mind. We got to give kids a clean slate. They deserve it. I think we would want that, right? In our coaching journey, right? If we had messed up or made a lot of mistakes at a previous stop, I think we'd want to come into a new place kind of with a clean slate, with people assuming the best. I think that's kind of what underlies it there. So love that you shared that.
There's 2 points on that I'm going to raise real quickly, Luke, just to add on to what you're saying, to support what you're saying. Actually, there's 2 points I have 2 points of view in that. One is, I'll always take that approach with a player, because I feel that player, like just us as human beings, us as adults as well, we're the same. We act differently in different environments. Like, so I don't behave the same way maybe at a table in a restaurant than I do when I'm eating my dinner at home. Maybe I'll put my feet up while I'm eating my dinner. I won't do that in a restaurant, for example. So I act differently in different environments. And and if I cross that over into our sporting coaching world, I believe that players take the shape of the environment you set. It may take time for them to realize what's acceptable and unacceptable. So I will never judge a player who's performed in another environment and just think that he'll be the same in my environment. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Oh, good gosh. I had 2 points. You triggered two thoughts in my head while you were saying it. One is the filter. I don't want the filter. And the second one escapes me. So we'll come back to it. But I think that the first one's really important. I'm not going to judge somebody else based on what they've done in your environment. I'm going to judge them based on what they do in my environment, because what you ask them to do and what I ask them to do could be different. So we get different versions of that person. The challenge between me and another coach, and there's a lot better coaches out there than me, can we get the best out of that young person in our environments, and how do we go about doing that? I think that's what we need to unpick. We don't need to unpick what that person has done in a previous environment. What can we do in our environment to get the best version of that performer, that person, that athlete? What can we do to get the best version? Yeah. You mentioned a while ago, Luke, and it's brilliant what you mentioned. You talked about you will answer a lot of these questions by asking yourself why you coach. You mentioned that a while ago. So can I pick up on it? And let me tackle it by sharing with you. Again, this is the movement model I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to take you back to one of the previous segments we talked about. And if I explain the movement model, basically movement was set up to help coaches, to help coaching development, to develop coaches, to support coaches. But the model is based around 4 blocks to do with coaching. And then what sits on top of those 4 blocks are 3 circles, and they're impact circles. But if I stay on the 4 coaching blocks, it will very much, it will bring us to more to the how, or sorry, to the who, which is you described, or sorry, why you coach, should I say, why you coach. So if you look at the 4 blocks as who you coach, why you coach, what you coach, and how you coach. So if you start with who you coach, so I coach a professional team, I coach an under 14 beginners team. If you look at who you coach, you will be able to shape better why you coach. So I do coach I'm part of a professional team here at the moment, and I do have a slightly different lens when I'm coaching that team, as opposed to when I'm supporting our under 14 coach at Bermuda Blaze coach that team, just because of the nature of who we're coaching. So why I coach could change. Now there'll be core fundamentals, which are based upon we see the player before the performer, we see the person before the performer, we see the person before the player. There's all those core principles that will underpin very much why you coach, but then the why can take a different strand. And what makes, like, and then when we move on to the what you coach, which is the Tech-tac, and then the how you coach, which are your coaching methodologies. If we move along this direction, I think we're going in a healthy direction. If we make the what, the Tech-tac we coach, clearer by analyzing deeply who we coach. So actually one supports the other. And if you start with why we coach, serving the who we coach, and then you're filling it in with the how you coach, I think you're moving in a healthy direction, regardless what level you coach, what age or stage you coach. If you start in that 4-step process, I think you're going to do all right as a coach. But if you're very much coming in at, which may be the case in many situations, if you're coming in at the Tech-tac as the most important thing when you start to plan your season, and it's preseason and you're planning things for the year ahead, if you're coming in with the Tech-tac and you're not thinking deeply about the people you coach, then you're probably going to end up with some red flags throughout the season, a lot of obstacles along the way.
Yeah, I think that was articulated really well. And as you were talking about it, it triggered a conversation I had with Sefu Bernard. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but he's in player development in the WNBA. And I had him on the podcast in episode 10, and he does a lot of stuff with youth basketball as well. But he said this, he said, your who and their why equal your what and your how. And I love that, because not only is our why important, but their why is important. And like you were just talking about, with the professionals you coach, part of their why is their livelihood, their well-being, right? Their financial stability. And so, I mean, that's a piece of probably your why with those professionals, if you want them to become the most valuable professional basketball players they can, because that's how they're making their living, right? But then when you get those under 14s, right, they're there to have fun, to connect with their friends, to grow at the game, right? So I think that is so important for us to keep at the forefront of our mind. I have kind of one more question in this strain of thoughts, and then I want to shift a little bit and talk about some of the dynamics of coaching the national team. And you kind of started to hit on a little bit with Tech-tac isn't enough, right? That the technical tackle, it is an important piece of what we do, but it's not enough. I would just love if you shared, like, what are some of the other areas that coaches should be educated in that maybe we're typically not, right? We're typically given some technical tactical stuff, some training on that, but I think there's a lot of other things that we would benefit by being trained on, knowing, but we don't get it. So would you speak to that?
Well, if you think about, I'll start with this. If you're just going to focus on the Tech-tac, which is, your lens you're wearing there is all about performance. But performance is more than Tech-tac. Performance is all those four areas we just talked about a moment ago, in terms of the 4 blocks. But if your whole thing is like, we've got to win, we've got to get better, we can't have any bad practices, we should be really considering the damage that's associated with driving athletes to become obsessed with that. Like, we really should question that, because you're not, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but you're dealing with people. You're not dealing with robots. So people have feelings, people have different things going on. But if we're just all about the Tech-tac, driving wins, driving performances, no bad practices, then we've got to be very careful, because that's a lot of damage comes with that, forcing players to be obsessed about those things. So going back to your question about there's more to it than just Tech-tac, the more to it is those things, like what way, let's go to the how. What way can I coach my players to make them feel needed, wanted, cared for, respected? If I'm talking at them the whole time, do they feel, does their opinion, does their thoughts feel valued? Does their opinions and thoughts on what we're doing, do they feel valued from that aspect? If we're talking down to them, telling them what to do all the time, then absolutely not. And I'm not saying that we don't tell them what to do. We certainly do, but there's a continuum, there's a spectrum from telling them what to do all the way through to discussing, to asking them what should we do, to asking them to share their thoughts and opinions on what we've just done and what we should do and could do. And I think if you look at the how aspect or the coaching methodologies, how much are you involving the players in the discussions during those practices, during those games? How much are you facilitating them to have a voice and a choice with what's going on? And I will go one step further by saying, we're not the experts in the room, Luke. The players, and we've got to build the learning on the players in front of us. So for example, if you're playing on my team and I'm saying to you, we're going to defend a stack ball screen by triple switching, and you're not, like, that's too much for you, you're not ready for that, then I'm probably stunting your performance, which means I'm stunting your growth, stunting your development, which means I'm impacting your confidence, I'm impacting your desire to be there, and I'm probably embarrassing you in front of the other guys who can do it. So actually involving you in that discussion, hey, Luke, I'm thinking about triple switching this stack ball screen that you're involved in. What are your thoughts on that? Coach, I have no idea what a triple switch is. I'm not ready for that. Can you show me at least? Let's have so now we have a conversation about it, and you have an opportunity to ask questions in a safe space, not in front of the teammates where I expose you in front of people. So having those conversations about what you're doing, what you're going to do, what you should do. I'll say one more. I learned more. I've done a lot of courses, Luke. I've had a lot of support from amazing people, like coaches who are way smarter than me. And I continue to get that support on a weekly basis. But I have never learned as much from anybody other than the players. And by asking them, what are you seeing? What are you noticing? I'm learning so much. Last night inside or Bermuda Blaze, I'm coaching a division. I'm coaching two teams at the moment. It's really enjoyable because I have to change my hats from assistant coach to head coach. But in Edinburgh last night, I'm coaching a Bermuda Blaze Scottish Division 1 team, men's team, practice twice a week kind of thing. Most of them are part-time, most of them have jobs or studying as well. And at the end of the practice, one of the players said, "Coach, can I make a point?" I said, "Guys, if you have anything to share," a really crappy, generic question. Anybody want to say anything? It's just rubbish, isn't it? But somebody said something. And the point he made last night was really valuable. It was about our press defense. And it was something I didn't think of. And in hindsight, I'm thinking I should have thought of that. But I'm a coach dealing with many things in one session, so it escaped me. But the fact that he felt comfortable and the environment allowed him to say it in front of everybody, it was a very valuable message that we will use this evening in our game, actually, that we will make sure that happens because that's super important. So there's a lot of value comes back to the coach when you ask the players questions. But let me add to the asking the player questions bit. Are you asking them players because modern methodologies and theories say we should involve the players and we should ask them questions? Are you asking them players because the theory says you should ask them questions? Or are you asking them questions because you're genuinely interested in what they have to say? And you see it a lot if you watch a lot of you watch enough practices, you'll see coaches asking great questions. And you'll see coaches asking questions because they feel like that's the right thing to do. And I think we all have to go. I'm not belittling that by any stretch of the imagination, Luke. I think we have to go on that journey to become good at asking questions, because I think asking questions is a lot harder than answering questions. And if you ask the right ones, you unlock some amazing stuff. But what the right questions to ask is really difficult. And it's a skill I think we have to practice, and we have to go through a certain stage to become good at that. And I'm nowhere near where I want to be with my ability to ask questions. But asking them with a genuine motive is the most important thing and something to consider.
Yeah, being genuinely curious, right? I'm actually asking a question here that I don't know the answer to. I want to know their thoughts and perspective. Are you watching Ted Lasso?
I watched it. It's brilliant. I think I've finished the 2 series that were on.
Yeah. Did you watch the newest episode that just came out?
I haven't seen. I know there's a couple of episodes come out. And I haven't seen them yet. I've seen the first 2 series.
I won't spoil it, but the season finale just came out today, episode 12. I stayed up too late last night, my time, to watch it, but there's a scene in the last episode of the season where they come in at halftime and the coaches are talking about the adjustment they should make. And they're like, well, what should we do? Should we stay with what we're doing or change it up? And Roy Kent just goes, well, we should, as Roy Kent always does, we should effing ask them. They're the ones doing this shit. And
brilliant.
Yeah, it was. And Ted's like, oh, like he has this light bulb moment, like, yeah, that's a good point. Let's do it. And he just goes and asks them. And to what you're saying there, it's like we should ask them more. We should get curious. We should ask them what they think. We should actually take it into consideration. We don't always do it, right? Because we know things that they don't. Our understanding of the game is typically at a different level, depending on the level you're coaching. But just asking, I think again, it builds trust, right? It puts them as people first, and recognizes that they're a part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't do it, we got to ask the question, why don't coaches not do it more? And I think that the barriers are pretty straightforward. Number one, we're worried about the time constraints. Oh, if I ask him, then it takes longer than if I just tell him. Yeah, you're right. I say to coaches all the time, you're absolutely right. But if you ask him and he has to think about it and he has to reach down into his own mind to come up with the answer, and you guide him towards that. And if you're skilled at that, it doesn't take long at all, actually. Then he'll remember it. But if you tell him, the chances of him remembering it are less. He may, but they're less. So that's obviously one of the barriers. The other barrier, and I'll get off this topic because we could go down a rabbit hole here. The other barrier is potential ego and perception. I'm the coach. I'm supposed to know everything. If the performance director or the club owner or the fans are watching me, then I need to be perceived as somebody who's directing and telling people where to go and leading people. And I think that's another major barrier. And I know coaches who coach at the pro level who actually want to coach a different way, but because of the perception, they're coaching a certain way. And I think that's really sad. I think that's really, really sad. And we talk about the mental health and mental well-being of players. Well, those coaches who want to coach a certain way, but coach another way, can you imagine the damage that's been done to their mental wellness and their mental well-being, and how long they'll actually stay in this profession because of those feelings? It's really, really interesting. But let's not go down a rabbit hole in that one, Luke, because it's a long conversation.
But I think it's such an important point. And again, we could talk about it for a long time. Yeah, those expectations that get put on us as coaches that we feel like we have to live up to. I've got to coach in a certain way, or I'm not doing my job. I think it's so important for us to recognize, and then again, like hopefully be able to break those. Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode. I'll be back next week with part 2 of this conversation with Alan. As always, if you enjoyed the episode and want a copy of the free podcast notes, go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or click the link in the show details. It's really hard to narrow down my takeaways from this episode. Alan shared so many powerful things. And I think it's worth just reiterating those 3 core values of movement sports that Alan and I discussed. The first, putting people first. The second, winning and impact don't have to compete. And the third, Tech-tac isn't enough. I love how he articulated each of those, and they all resonated with me deeply. I think it's also worth highlighting the story Alan shared about his player again. We need to give athletes a blank slate. I really respect that Alan didn't let what other coaches told him determine his view or his treatment of this young man. And like Alan shared, which I think there is so much wisdom in, we shouldn't judge an athlete on what they were like in someone else's environment. Because like he said, players take the shape of the environment you set. And the other piece of that story that's worth highlighting again is how important it is to be intentional about building those relationships. Alan probably wouldn't have had that breakthrough with that young man that he did if it weren't for the months of phone calls that he made prior to that. It's about people. Let's never forget that. Like I mentioned in the intro, if you want to learn more about how we serve coaches and organizations, go to cuttingedgecoach.com or just reach out to me via email at luke@cuttingedgecoach.com. I'll be back next week with part 2 of this conversation. Thanks for listening to the podcast.